Your grandparents probably fought. Money problems, in-law problems, the kind of silence at dinner that says more than shouting ever could. And then, they stayed. Not for one more year, for 50. Somewhere in your family tree, there's a couple who got married with nothing. No savings, no house, sometimes not even a steady job. They said their vows in a church basement or a courthouse hallway, wearing a borrowed suit or a dress made from a flour sack. And they were still holding hands 40 years later. At an anniversary dinner, nobody thought to film, because nobody thought it was remarkable. It was just what marriage was. Now look at today. We have more comfort than any generation in human history. Climate control, 2 incomes, dating apps that promise to filter out anyone who isn't compatible. And somehow, marriages don't last the way they used to. We have couples counselors, self-help books, relationship coaches on every platform, an entire industry built to teach us something our own grandparents never had to be taught. Something got lost between their kitchen table and ours. Not money, not comfort. Something else, a way of understanding commitment that didn't depend on feeling good every single day. This isn't a video about romanticizing poverty or pretending hardship is some kind of magic glue. Plenty of Depression-era marriages were unhappy, and plenty of people stayed in situations they shouldn't have. We're not going to pretend otherwise. But something real did happen to marriage during those years. A set of quiet, practical understandings about what commitment actually meant, that an entire generation carried for the rest of their lives. 9 of them. And by the end of this video, you're going to recognize a few of them in your own relationship. The ones we still have, and the ones we quietly let go. Here's the first thing that generation understood, and it sounds almost too simple to matter. They didn't wait to feel like staying married. They just stayed married. Feelings were something that happened to you. Commitment was something you did. Picture a young couple in 1932, married 18 months, living in 2 rooms above a hardware store that was barely staying open. The husband had lost his job twice already that year. The wife took in laundry to make up the difference. There were nights they didn't speak to each other for hours after an argument about money. The kind of silence that, today, gets described in a therapy session as a communication breakdown. Back then, it just got described as Tuesday. Nobody assumed the marriage was in trouble because 2 people were tired and irritable. The marriage wasn't a barometer of their mood. It was the fixed point. Everything else moved around. That distinction mattered because of how people in that era actually talked about marriage. Sociologist Andrew Cherlin, who has spent his career studying the American family, has pointed out that Depression-era couples were operating inside a culture where marriage was understood as an institution you upheld, a role you filled, rather than a relationship you continuously evaluated for personal satisfaction. The idea that a marriage should be reassessed every time it stopped feeling good simply wasn't part of how people thought about it. Compare that to now. We've built an entire emotional vocabulary. I'm not feeling fulfilled. We've grown apart. I deserve to be happy. That treats the day-to-day feeling of a relationship as the primary test of whether it should continue. None of those phrases are wrong to feel, but they didn't exist as the default lens their grandparents used, because staying wasn't up for a daily vote. You don't have to import 1932 into your own marriage to take something from this. The habit worth stealing is smaller than that. The next time a bad week makes the whole relationship feel shaky, try asking a different question than, "Do I still feel it?" Ask what you're actually deciding, because for that generation, commitment was never a feeling you waited on. It was a decision you kept making, quietly, on the days it was hardest to make it. Here's an uncomfortable truth this video isn't going to hide from. A lot of those marriages stayed together for a reason that had nothing to do with love. It was money. Plain, unromantic, sometimes unfair money. Think about what leaving a marriage actually required in the early 1930s. A lawyer, court fees. In most states, proof of fault, cruelty, desertion, adultery, because we're just not happy anymore, wasn't a legal reason to end a marriage yet. And even if a couple could clear those hurdles, then came the part nobody budgets for. 2 households instead of 1, at a moment when one household was already struggling to put food on the table. For a huge number of couples, divorce wasn't a decision they were choosing against. It was a door that was functionally locked. The marriage rate itself tells the story of just how hard those years hit family life. In 1929, the U.S. marriage rate stood at about 10.1 per 1,000 people. By 1932, at the depth of the Depression, it had fallen to 7.9, a drop of roughly 25% in just 3 years, as couples who wanted to marry simply couldn't afford to start a household. If getting married was that financially out of reach, staying married once you'd already committed became, for many couples, the only option that made economic sense. Today, none of those locked doors exist. No-fault divorce means you don't need to prove anything. Legal processes have become faster and, relative to income, more accessible than they've ever been. That's not something to mourn. For people in genuinely harmful marriages, it's one of the great quiet victories of the last century. And this video isn't here to argue otherwise. But it's worth being honest about what that freedom cost us, in a different way. It removed the floor. When staying is always optional, every hard month becomes a referendum on whether the marriage should exist at all. That generation didn't have that referendum available to them, which meant they had to find other reasons to make it work. The habit worth taking from this one isn't make divorce harder. It's simpler. Before treating a rough patch as evidence the relationship has failed, ask whether you're actually facing an unsolvable problem, or just an uncomfortable one you have the option to walk away from. Here's the thing about watching this from a distance, decades later. It's easy to admire the resilience and forget the exhaustion underneath it. These weren't cheerful people, gritting their teeth through hardship for our benefit. They were tired, scared, and doing the best they could with almost nothing. Keep that in mind as we go into the next one, because what's coming isn't really about money at all. The second thing that generation had, and its one modern marriage has almost entirely lost, was a script. Everyone knew, walking in, roughly what their job was. That certainty removed an entire category of daily conflict that today's couples negotiate from scratch, over and over, for years. Picture a household in 1934. The husband, when he had work, brought home the wages. The wife ran the domestic economy, stretching those wages across rent, food, coal, and whatever was left for the children. And when his hours got cut, or his job disappeared entirely, which happened constantly during those years, she often became the one holding the family together financially, through sewing, taking in boarders, or piecework done at the kitchen table after the children were asleep. Nobody had a meeting about who would do what. The roles were already understood, even as they bent and shifted under pressure. Sociologist Glenn H. Elder Jr., in his landmark study, Children of the Great Depression, tracked families through exactly this kind of strain. Households where economic loss forced fathers to lose authority and mothers to take on greater practical control, and documented how couples adapted their roles under pressure, rather than treating that shift as a crisis of the marriage itself. The roles moved. The commitment didn't. Now compare that to a modern household, where 2 people often work full-time, split, or fight about chores, finances, childcare, and emotional labor with no shared script at all, renegotiating the terms of the partnership more or less continuously. That's not automatically worse. A script that excluded women from financial power and men from domestic life had real costs of its own, and nobody watching this should want that whole system back. But the constant renegotiation has a cost too. It turns every dish left in the sink into a referendum on fairness, respect, and whether the relationship is working. You don't need 1934's roles to borrow 1934's clarity. Sit down with your partner and actually name, out loud, who owns what. Not as a rulebook carved in stone, but as a shared understanding you're not relitigating every single week. There's a reason your grandparents cared so much what the neighbors thought, and it wasn't just old-fashioned nosiness. In a Depression-era community, the people around you weren't just watching your marriage, they were holding it up. And that web of watchful, involved, sometimes suffocating neighbors did something we've almost completely dismantled. It made walking away a public act, not a private one. Picture the geography of an ordinary working-class block in the 1930s. You knew the family on either side of you. The one across the street, the couple 2 doors down. You shared tools, borrowed a cup of flour, minded each other's kids, sat on the front steps in the evening heat, because there was nowhere else to cool off. Your mother-in-law probably lived within walking distance, if not in the spare room. Your church knew your name. When a marriage started to fray, a dozen people noticed before either spouse said a word, and a dozen people, for better and for worse, had opinions about it. That kind of visibility cut both ways, and it's important to be honest about the bad edge of it. Social pressure kept some people trapped in marriages that were genuinely miserable, and the stigma around divorce fell hardest on women, who often had the least power to leave and the most to lose by staying. This isn't a story about how shame was good for people. It wasn't. But that same dense web of community did something we've lost almost entirely. It surrounded a struggling marriage with support and accountability at the same time. There were people to talk you down after a fight, people who'd watched 100 rough patches and knew they passed, people whose quiet expectation was simply that you'd work it out, because that's what everyone around you had done. Today, most of us could get divorced, and half the people in our lives wouldn't find out for months. We've traded the suffocating village for total privacy, and privacy has real benefits. But it also means your marriage now succeeds or fails almost entirely on the strength of 2 people, with no one else invested in it holding on. You can't rebuild the 1930s block, but you can choose to let a few trusted people actually see your marriage, the hard parts included, instead of performing a perfect one online and struggling in total isolation offline. Notice how many of these come back to the same quiet idea, that a marriage wasn't only the business of the 2 people inside it. It had witnesses, it had weight, it had a whole world leaning on it. We tend to think of that as a burden. This next one asks whether some of it was actually holding people up. Here's a skill that generation had that we've quietly let atrophy. They knew how to stay in the room. When conflict came, and it came constantly, because poverty is a pressure cooker, they didn't have the modern escape hatches we reach for. So they learned to fight a marriage's problems instead of fighting their way out of the marriage. Picture an argument in a cramped apartment in 1935. There's no spare bedroom to storm off to, no car to drive around in for 3 hours, no phone to scroll through, no group chat to vent to, no separate life waiting on the other side of a screen. When 2 people had a conflict, they had it in a small space, with the walls close, and then they had to figure out how to eat breakfast across the same table the next morning. The problem didn't get outsourced or postponed. It got worked through, or at least worked around, because there was physically nowhere for it to go. That constant, unavoidable proximity built something that's genuinely hard to build today, the muscle of repair. Not the absence of conflict. These couples argued plenty, but the practiced ability to come back together after it. They knew, from doing it over and over, that a bad fight on Tuesday didn't have to mean a cold war through Friday. They'd learned that anger passed, that the person across the table was still the person across the table, and that the marriage was bigger than any single bad night inside it. We've engineered that muscle out of our lives, mostly without noticing. We have so many ways to avoid the hard conversation. A whole second world in our pockets. Endless distraction. The easy option of simply going somewhere else, until we've cooled off separately, instead of together. Avoidance feels like peace. It's usually just delay. The habit worth reclaiming here is uncomfortable, but simple. The next time you're tempted to leave the room, physically or mentally, try staying in it a little longer than feels good. Not to win the fight, to practice the thing they never got to opt out of. Coming back together is a skill, and skills only grow with the reps you'd rather skip. Now we come to the number, the hard fact at the center of this whole story, and the one that's most often misused. Because the statistic is real, but the lesson people draw from it is usually wrong. Let's get both right. During the Great Depression, the American divorce rate fell to one of the lowest points of the entire 20th century. In 1930, the rate stood at about 1.6 divorces per 1,000 people. By 1933, the very worst year of the Depression, when nearly a quarter of the workforce was unemployed, it had dropped to around 1.3. Sociologist Andrew Cherlin, tracking the same period, found the divorce rate declined roughly 25% between 1929 and 1933. Put that next to today. The current U.S. divorce rate sits at roughly 2.3 to 2.4 per 1,000 people, according to CDC figures, nearly double that Depression-era low. And here's where you have to be honest, because the easy version of this story is a lie. That rate didn't fall because Depression-era couples had cracked the code on love. It fell, in large part, because people couldn't afford to divorce. The lawyer, the court, the two households, and because the law and the social stigma made it enormously difficult, especially for women. Cherlin puts it plainly. The Depression didn't prevent divorce so much as postpone it. The rate climbed again through the later 1930s, and then spiked hard after the war. The marriages that couldn't be dissolved in 1933 didn't all become happy. Some just waited. So what's the real lesson? If it isn't, misery keeps people together. It's this: strip away the money and the law and the stigma, all the external walls that held those marriages in place, and you're left with a generation that, for whatever mix of reasons, developed a default setting we've lost. Staying was the assumption, and leaving was the exception you had to justify. We've reversed that. For a lot of modern couples, leaving has quietly become the assumption the moment things get hard, and staying is what needs justifying. The villain here was never divorce. Divorce is often the right, necessary, even life-saving choice. And no one watching this should stay somewhere they're being harmed to honor some vintage ideal. The villain is the throwaway reflex, the same one that tells us to replace the phone instead of repairing it, now aimed at people. The question worth sitting with isn't, should divorce be harder? It's, have I started treating a person like something disposable the moment they stopped being convenient? That's the heaviest one. And if you felt the weight of it, good. Sit with it a second. This isn't about guilt. And it's definitely not about judging anyone who's been through a divorce. It's about noticing a reflex we've all absorbed without choosing it. Take a breath. The next few are gentler. and they're about what actually held people together once the walls came down. Here's something scarcity did that abundance quietly undid. It fused two people into a single working unit. In a Depression household, a marriage wasn't mainly a romance or an emotional partnership. It was a survival operation, and both people were essential to it running. You didn't leave your business partner in the middle of a crisis. You couldn't. Picture the actual machinery of a 1933 household getting by on almost nothing. One person stretches $1 of flour and beans into a week of meals. The other patches the roof, mends the shoes, takes whatever day work turns up. She keeps a garden out back and cans what it produces. He barters a repaired fence for a neighbor's eggs. Every skill either person had was load-bearing. Remove one of them, and the whole structure didn't just get lonelier. It stopped functioning. The marriage was, in the most literal sense, how the family stayed alive. That interdependence created a kind of bond that's genuinely hard to manufacture when you don't need it. When your spouse is the reason there's food on the table and a roof that doesn't leak. Growing apart isn't an abstract emotional risk. It's a threat to your survival, and it focuses the mind wonderfully. The relationship was reinforced daily by 100 small acts of mutual dependence that nobody thought to call romantic, because they were too busy being necessary. Now think about how thoroughly modern life has dissolved that. We can outsource nearly everything a spouse used to provide: meals delivered, repairs hired out, income fully independent, entertainment, and even companionship available on demand from a screen. That independence is a genuine gift. Nobody should have to stay married just to eat. But it also means the practical glue is gone. Two people can now share a home and a bed while running two entirely separate lives, needing each other for almost nothing. You can't manufacture a depression to rebuild that dependence, and you wouldn't want to. But you can choose interdependence on purpose, deliberately building a life where you actually rely on each other for real things, rather than two self-sufficient people who happen to cohabit, need each other a little. It's not weakness. For that generation, it was the strongest thread they had. Everyone at a wedding hears the same words: for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health. We say them like poetry, beautiful, a little abstract, the emotional high point before the kiss. That generation heard them differently. They heard them as terms, an actual contract they were signing, with clauses that were going to be tested, and soon. Here's the thing about a couple marrying in 1931. The worse and the poorer weren't hypothetical. They were the weather. A young couple standing at the altar that year already knew, or was about to learn, exactly what for poorer meant, because it was happening to everyone around them in real time. There was no illusion that the vow covered only the good version. The vow was clearly, obviously about the bad version, because the bad version was the one they were living in. In sickness meant something too. In an era before antibiotics, before most of the medical safety net we take for granted, when a single illness could hollow out a family. These weren't romantic flourishes. They were a realistic list of what was coming. And because the words were understood as literal terms, they carried weight the whole way through. When the worse arrived, the lost job, the sick child, the year everything went wrong, a lot of people in that generation reached back to those vows, not as a warm memory, but as a binding commitment. I said for worse. This is the worse. The promise had anticipated this exact moment, and so the moment, however brutal, didn't feel like grounds for reconsidering the whole arrangement. It felt like the part of the deal they'd already agreed to. We've slowly let those same words drift back into abstraction. We still say them. But for a lot of us, for worse quietly means for somewhat worse. For poorer means for a little less comfortable. And the sickness we picture is the kind that passes. When the real version shows up, the genuinely hard year, the illness that doesn't resolve, the long grinding stretch with no clear end, it can feel like a violation of the deal rather than the fulfillment of it. But it was always the deal. It was right there in the words. You don't have to be religious, or even married in a church, to take this one. Whatever promise you made to your person, in whatever words, go back and read it literally. Ask yourself whether you meant the worst part, or only ever really signed up for the better. Because that generation meant all of it, and that's a large part of why they lasted. We're down to the last one, and it might be the most important, because it's the one that quietly undoes a story our whole culture keeps telling us about love. Everything so far has circled around it. Roles, community, the vows, the money. Underneath all of it was a single stubborn idea about what a marriage was actually for. Here it is. Here's the belief that held the whole thing together, and it's the one we've most completely lost. That generation never expected marriage to make them happy every day. Not because they were joyless, or settling, or didn't believe in love, but because they understood love as something you built and maintained over decades, not a feeling you were owed at every moment. And that single adjustment in expectation changed everything about whether they stayed. Think about what a marriage actually looks like across 50 years, from the inside. There are stretches, sometimes long ones, where the feeling of being in love simply isn't there. The exhausting years with small children, the grief years, the years someone is sick or unemployed, or just quietly difficult to live with. Every marriage that lasts passes through these valleys. It's not a sign of failure. It's the shape of the terrain. That generation knew the valleys were coming and didn't mistake them for the end of the road. They understood that the feeling would recede and return, recede and return, and that the marriage was the thing that held steady underneath the tide. We were raised on a different story, that the feeling is the marriage, that if the spark fades, something is broken, that constant fulfillment is the baseline a good relationship should deliver, that when you stop feeling in love, the honest thing to do is leave and find it again somewhere else. It's a beautiful story, and it sells a lot of songs and movies. It also sets a standard no marriage in human history has ever actually met, and then quietly blames the marriage for failing to meet it. This is the throwaway culture's final and most personal move. The same logic that tells you a 3-year-old phone is obsolete because a shinier one exists, whispering that a partner who no longer gives you constant butterflies is a partner you've outgrown. Objects, then people. Replace instead of repair. Upgrade instead of maintain. Maybe the most radical thing you can do, in a culture like ours, is to expect less of the feeling and more of the person. To let love be a thing that fades and returns, without panicking every time it's low. To treat the flat stretches not as evidence you chose wrong, but as the ordinary weather of a long life shared with someone. That generation didn't have better feelings than we do. They just asked their feelings to carry a lot less, and asked their commitment to carry the rest. So here we are, at the end of 9 of them. Commitment as a decision instead of a feeling. Clear roles instead of constant renegotiation. A community that held the marriage up, the muscle of repair. 2 people fused into one economy. Vows read literally. And underneath all of it, that stubborn refusal to expect happiness every single day. Now, let's be careful about what we do with this, because it would be easy to walk away from this video thinking the answer is to go backward. It isn't. Nobody watching this should want to return to 1935. Not to the locked legal doors that trapped people in genuinely harmful marriages. Not to the roles that shut women out of financial power and men out of their own homes. Not to the stigma that fell hardest on the people with the least ability to escape it. That world had real cruelties in it, and the freedoms we've won since are worth keeping. Divorce, when it's the right choice, is the right choice. Full stop. But maybe the lesson was never, go back. Maybe it's smaller and quieter than that. Maybe we don't need to return to 1935. But maybe we should stop throwing quite so much away. Because that's what this channel keeps finding. Over and over. In habit after habit. A generation that repaired things instead of replacing them. That made do and mended. That saw the value in the worn and the difficult and the imperfect and chose to keep it anyway. They applied that to their socks and their furniture and their kitchen scraps. And it turns out they applied it to each other too. The throwaway reflex didn't stop at objects. It came for our relationships as well. The same whisper that says the old thing is obsolete the moment a shinier option appears. The most quietly radical thing you can do about that isn't to make leaving harder. It's to make staying, when staying is right, a real option again. To pick up the needle before you throw the whole thing out. If any of this landed, if you recognized your grandparents in it, or recognized something you'd quietly let slip in your own life, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel reach more people who grew up hearing these stories and are hungry to remember them. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe. This whole series is about recovering the things that generation knew and we forgot, one habit at a time, and I'd love to have you here for the rest of it. And if this one spoke to you, go back and watch the last episode. 8 Sewing Habits. People who lived through the Depression never lost. It's the same idea, applied to the sewing box instead of the marriage. The same refusal to throw away something that could still be mended. You'll see the thread running straight through both. No pun intended. But before you go, I want to leave you with a question. And I really do read the answers. Of all 9 of these, which one is still alive in your own family? Which of these did your grandparents or parents live by? And which one do you most wish you could get back? Tell me down in the comments. I'll be reading. They never left. Not because it was easy. Because they'd decided, a long time ago, that leaving wasn't the first thing you reached for when it got hard. Maybe that's the one worth keeping.